You scroll through your feed and bam, another headline pops up about transgender athletes in school sports. It feels like it's everywhere now.
It really does. It's gone from maybe a more niche topic to being right in the national spotlight.
Exactly. And if you're like us, you want to get past the headlines, really understand what's going on,
Which is precisely what we're aiming to do today. We're taking a deep dive into this whole intersection of gender and school sports.
Our focus is going to be pretty sharp today, right?
Yeah.
Looking at the recent federal stuff, the legal challenges,
Yeah.
especially what's happening in Maine.
Yeah, Maine is definitely a key case study here. And to help us unpack it all, we've got some solid sources lined up.
Right. We've got a Congressional Research Service report, CRS, from March 2025. Gender in school sports, federal action and legal challenges to state laws. Pretty direct title.
Yep. And we've also looked at news articles, Bangor Daily News, some from Fox News, Politico, plus, viewpoints from places like TikTok, Reddit, trying to get a broad picture.
And critically, there's that letter from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the OCR, to Maine's Department of Education. That seems pretty important.
Oh, definitely. So our mission really is to pull out the key legal and political threads, especially this clash between the Trump administration and Maine.
And make sense of the legal frameworks underneath it all, like Title IX, the Equal Protection Clause, how they're being, interpreted and fought over right now.
Precisely. Understanding those foundations is key.
Okay, so let's jump in. Legal groundwork first. Title IX, we hear it all the time. What's its core purpose in this context?
Well, Title IX, it's a big one, goes back to 1972. Fundamentally, it's about ensuring girls and women get equal opportunities in any education program or activity that gets federal funding.
Any program. So that definitely includes sport.
It absolutely includes sports. Historically, opportunities for girls in sports were way behind boys. Title IX was meant to, level that playing field.
All right, correcting those historical gaps. Now, you mentioned Maine specifically. They have their own state law, too, right?
Yes, the Maine Human Rights Act. And it's been updated 2019 and 2021 to specifically prohibit discrimination based on gender identity in places like schools.
Okay, so Maine state law seems pretty clear on protecting transgender students.
It does. And this is where the friction really starts. The CRS report points out these conflicting interpretations of Title IX when it comes to transgender athletes.
How so? What are the main conflicting views?
Well, you have the Trump administration's position, which is essentially that Title IX prohibits transgender girls and women from competing in girls' and women's sports. They see it as protecting cisgender female athletes.
Okay, that sounds directly opposed to how Maine seems to interpret its own laws.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you have many advocates and legal scholars who interpret Title IX differently. They argue it allows or even requires schools to let transgender students participate consistent with their gender identity.
Their argument being that excluding them is the discrimination Title IX forbids.
Precisely. That excluding them is a form of sex discrimination. So two fundamentally different readings of the same law.
Okay, this is clearly bigger than just Title IX. The Equal Protection Clause.
Yeah.
That keeps coming up, too. How does it fit in?
Right. The Equal Protection Clause, that's from the 14th Amendment. Basically, it means states have to apply laws equally to everyone. And this principle also applies to the federal government through the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause.
So if the government treats different groups differently,
it needs a good reason, a sufficient justification. And courts have different ways of testing how good that reason needs to be. These are the levels of scrutiny.
Yes, scrutiny. Can you break those down for us? Keep it simple.
Sure. Think of it like how skeptical the court is. The lowest level is rational basis. Is the law reasonably related to a legitimate government goal? It's usually pretty easy for the government to pass this test.
Okay, lowest bar.
Then there's intermediate scrutiny. This is key because it's used for classifications based on sex. Here, the government needs an exceedingly persuasive justification. The law has to be substantially related to an important government goal. Much tougher.
Exceedingly persuasive?
Yeah.
Got it. And the highest?
Strict scrutiny. That's for things like race, what they call suspect classifications. The law has to be narrowly tailored to achieve a compelling government interest. It's very hard for a law to survive strict scrutiny. Think of blatant racial discrimination that would trigger it.
That helps a lot. So where does gender identity fall in this scrutiny framework? Is it settled?
That's a huge point of debate. The Supreme Court hasn't actually ruled definitively on what level of scrutiny applies specifically to gender identity classifications.
Just still developing law.
Very much so. But, as the CRS report notes, quite a few federal appeals courts have treated discrimination against transgender people as a form of sex discrimination.
Which would mean intermediate scrutiny.
Right. Or some courts have suggested transgender status itself might be a quasi-suspect class, which would also lead to intermediate scrutiny. So that's where a lot of the legal action is focused.
Okay, so the legal principles themselves are still being fought over in court.
Absolutely. And because of that, the CRS report shows that court decisions on transgender athletes under Title IX and equal protection are, well, all over the map. Some courts find restrictions violate the law, others uphold them, often focusing on biological sex differences.
It's a patchwork then. And Congress has tried to step in too, right? I remember reading about H.R. 28.
Yes, that's correct. In January 2025, the House passed H.R. 28, the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act.
And what would that do if it became law?
It would essentially amend Title IX to define sex strictly based on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth. The practical effect would be to restrict transgender women and girls from participating in female school sports programs receiving federal funds.
Okay, that gives us a good handle on the broader legal picture. Now, let's zoom in on Maine. It really feels like ground zero for this lately. What's the story there?
Yeah, Maine is a fascinating and quite intense case study. So before February 2025, the situation was relatively stable in a way.
How so?
Well, the Maine Department of Education interpreted the state's Human Rights Act, plus a specific joint rule they have, as basically allowing transgender students to play sports according to their gender identity.
And the schools themselves?
The Maine Principals Association, the MPA, which runs high school sports, they had a policy essentially letting local schools decide on eligibility. Generally an inclusive approach, it seems.
So things were leaning towards inclusion in Maine. What changed?
Things got tense in early February 2025. That's when the Trump administration issued its executive order focusing specifically on transgender athletes in schools.
And how did Maine react to that federal order?
Well, the MPA publicly stated they were sticking with their existing inclusive policy despite the federal directive.
So direct pushback. And were there other tensions brewing between Maine and the feds around that time?
Yes, definitely. Governor Janet Mills was quite vocal, saying that the federal government was scrutinizing all sorts of Maine programs, food assistance, fishing, support for seniors, new parents, and she felt it was politically motivated.
So a broader pattern of conflict.
It seemed that way. And interestingly, just before May 1st, a federal judge actually sided with Maine on one of those issues, ordering the administration to unfreeze funding for a food program.
Okay, that really sets the scene for the big legal move, the DOJ lawsuit against Maine. What happened on May 1st?
Right. On Wednesday, May 1st, 2025, the Department of Justice announced it was suing the state of Maine.
And the basis for the lawsuit?
Their claim is that Maine's policy allowing participation based on gender identity violates Title IX because, in their view, it denies equal athletic opportunities to cisgender female athletes.
And Governor Mills's reaction, was it conciliatory?
Not at all. She came out swinging, pledged to vigorously defend Maine, framed it as a states' rights issue, and basically warned other states that they could be next if the federal government pursued this path.
Sounds like this had been building for a while. Was there history there?
There was. Fox News reported on what they called a hostile exchange between President Trump and Governor Mills back at a White House meeting in February. Apparently, it ended with both saying something like, "See you in court."
Wow. So the lawsuit wasn't entirely out of the blue then?
Seems like the culmination of that escalating tension.
What about public opinion in Maine itself? Where do people stand?
It's interesting. That same Fox News report mentioned a poll by the American Parents Coalition in Maine. According to that survey, a majority of registered voters, 63%, actually supported basing sports participation on biological sex.
And restricting women's sports to biological females.
Yeah, 66% reportedly agreed with that. The poll also suggested a majority would back a ballot initiative to make that official policy in Maine.
So according to that poll, there's significant public support in Maine for the position the Trump administration is taking, even if the state government opposes it.
That seems to be what that particular poll suggests, yes. It adds another layer to the conflict.
Now, that letter from the Office for Civil Rights, the OCR, back in March, that seems really crucial. What did it actually say?
It was a big step. Dated March 19th, addressed to Maine's Education Commissioner, Pender Macon. It laid out the findings of OCR's investigation.
And their conclusion was?
They concluded that the Maine Department of Education's interpretation of state law and the resulting guidance to schools actually results in denying equal athletic opportunities for female students. And that, they said, violates Title IX's.
Did they give specific examples or reasons?
Yes. The letter specifically mentioned finding, based on public info, at least 3 instances where male athletes competed in girls' or women's high school sports in Maine. It also mentioned use of associated facilities like locker rooms.
And OCR's position was that this is not allowed under Title IX.
Their argument was pretty clear. Title IX doesn't permit a situation where you promise girls a competition or a locker room, but then allow males into those spaces or competitions.
So what did OCR tell Maine it had to do?
They asserted that the Maine Department of Education has the authority and the obligation under Title IX to tell local school districts they must restrict eligibility for girls' and women's sports to only female students.
Wow, a direct order, essentially.
Pretty much. And they went further, suggesting the state education department should even refuse to associate with organizations like the Maine Principals Association if the MPA maintained policies OCR deemed discriminatory.
So the federal argument boils down to Maine's inclusion is discrimination against girls under Title IX.
That's the core of their legal stance, yes. That prioritizing gender identity in this way undermines the equal opportunities Title IX was designed to protect for female athletes.
It's also worth remembering the NCAA updated its policy recently, didn't they? February 2025. How does that fit?
Right. The NCAA's latest policy says transgender women generally can't compete on women's teams, though they can still practice and receive support. It also says any athlete can participate on men's teams if they meet other criteria.
But NCAA rules don't override laws, right?
Exactly. As the CRS report points out, local, state, and federal laws supersede NCAA policy. In fact, the NCAA itself kind of acknowledged the Trump executive order provided a clear national standard.
And Maine isn't the only place seeing legal challenges over inclusive policies, is it?
Oh, not at all. The CRS report mentions other significant lawsuits like Gaines v. NCAA and Slusser v. Mountain West Conference.
What are those cases about?
In those, you have cisgender female athletes suing, arguing that allowing transgender women to compete on women's teams violates their rights under Title IX's and the Equal Protection Clause. So it's definitely a nationwide legal battle playing out.
Okay, so looking forward, what should we be watching for? What might Congress do? What's next?
Well, Congress, as we mentioned, has already considered bills like H.R. 28. That conversation will likely continue. A big thing to watch is the Supreme Court.
Why the Supreme Court specifically?
They're currently looking at a case involving policies related to transgender minors. While maybe not directly about sports, their ruling could offer major clues or even precedents on how these broader legal questions about gender identity and discrimination should be handled.
And the different presidential administrations clearly have very different views.
Absolutely. That political dimension adds a whole other layer of uncertainty depending on who is in power.
And you mentioned earlier that even the federal courts aren't all on the same page about how existing laws apply here.
Right. That circuit split is important. Specifically on whether the reasoning from the Bostock case, the Supreme Court case that said sex discrimination under Title VII employment law includes gender identity, should apply equally to Title IX in education.
Some courts say yes, some say no.
Pretty much. Some say the logic applies, discrimination is discrimination. Others say, well, Title IX is different. It's based on the spending clause. It explicitly allows sex separation in some contexts like sports, so Bostock doesn't automatically transfer.
And the level of scrutiny under equal protection also varies.
Yes. Different circuits might apply intermediate scrutiny for different reasons. Some because it's sex discrimination. Others may be viewing transgender status as a quasi-suspect class. Yeah. It's complex. It often takes the Supreme Court to eventually iron out those kinds of disagreements between lower courts.
Okay, so summing it all up, it feels like we're really in the thick of it. You've got these fundamental disagreements on reading Title IX, questions about how equal protection applies, courts reaching different conclusions, and then these intense political and legal fights erupting like we're seeing so clearly in Maine right now.
Exactly. It's a deeply complex situation, with very strong feelings on all sides. The legal ground is definitely shifting, and it's hard to say exactly where it will all land.
It really gives you a lot to think about. With all these conflicting legal views, the federal pressure, the state pushback, how do we find that balance? Protecting equal opportunities, but also dealing with the concerns people raise about fairness, about privacy in sports.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. It impacts student athletes everywhere, and it's clearly a conversation that's far from over. We'll definitely keep tracking it for you.